You guys ready for another fun-filled week? Me too. It's going to be great. Okay, so we made it through our kinetics and pH part. That will come back again at some point. But we're on to lipids and membrane components and a variety of different things. So I just posted an update to this lecture. You guys should be able to see that now so you can follow along. So to start out with, we want to define what lipids are. What exactly are we talking about here? And these are going to be this really large group of molecules that's incredibly diverse. And we're going to have to learn quite a few different ones when we go throughout today's lecture. But keep in mind that there are a couple of different things that they all have in common. So they're organic compounds, and they're hydrophobic or they're amphiphilic, meaning that they have characteristics of being both hydrophobic and hydrophilic. They are water insoluble usually, because these are going to be like your oils and your fats. And these are going to become incredibly important when we talk about different ways that we can prepare drug formulations, which we may or may not get to in this class. But it's a pretty interesting and broad field of study. These are highly soluble in nonpolar organic solvents. So these are examples of what I'm talking about there. And in general, people don't think of lipids as forming polymers. Now, some people say that you can have a monosaccharide unit or you can have a single unit and that the lipid bilayer is the polymer. But in general, people say that lipids don't form polymers. So that makes them unique when we talk about our biomolecules that we've kind of talked about throughout. There are 5 different classes that we're going to talk about today, and there are 3 functional classifications. So the functional classifications are either for storage, structural, or as hormones. And then underneath each of those classifications, there's 2 different things under storage. Those are going to be your free fatty acids, try saying that fast a few times, and your triacylglycerols or your triglycerides. Now, triacylglycerols and triglycerides are the same thing. So we'll try to refer to them as triglycerides throughout the rest of the lecture. And then under structural, you have your phospholipids and your glycolipids. And then steroids kind of hang out over here in their own category called hormones that are incredibly important to us. And they are classified as lipids because they're all deriving from cholesterol. So that makes them rather interesting. So in general, they're going to originate from 2 distinct types of subunits. You have your ketoacetyls, and those are made up of acetyl and propionyl that you can see over here. And you can see the difference between these 2. You have a CH2 here, and then you have this methanol component right here. And then isoprene is the other one. And again, you can see these 2 double bonded carbons that are coming off, and they're always found in trans for this particular isoprene. I should never say always, but in general, they're found in trans. So then we can also classify them according to either simple or complex. So simple lipids are going to be your fatty acids. So you've got your glycerol kind of core, and then you have fatty acid chains coming off of that core. And then you can have your complex, which are going to be your structural. So these are going to be your storage in general, and these are going to be your structural. So those are your phospholipids and your glycolipids. Now, glycolipids are pretty easy to figure out because they have that glyco component. So that's that sugar molecule that we're used to seeing. And really the main component here is the sphingosine. And we'll talk a lot about that here. And they all have this fatty acid type chain on them. And then it's really just a matter of how does that head group change. So in glycerol phospholipids, you have an alcohol. And that's really kind of the basis of what makes those unique, is this alcohol. In sphingolipids, you have choline right here. And these are both attached through these phosphate bonds. And then the glycolipids, the sphingosine is different because you're not attaching through that same type of attachment. You're not attaching through that ester type bond. And then you have your fatty acid and you have your sugar component. So they get incredibly complex. As you can see, we're changing the head group here. We're changing how many fatty acids are around. And then we've got our simple ones over here. So you can think of simple for storage and complex as being your membrane components. So again, we've got our fatty acids, so we're kind of delving a little bit into our simple, and we're going to go through our simple and then our complex. But these, again, are going to be our triglycerides, sphingolipids, phosphoacetylglycerols, and glycolipids. They're going to be our lipid-soluble vitamins, and we'll talk a lot about lipid-soluble vitamins today. There are certain vitamins that are water-soluble, which means you're going to excrete them through your urine. And then there are certain vitamins that are lipid-soluble, and so they're going to be retained in your fat deposits. And that means that you can overdose on certain vitamins, and you really can't overdose as much on other vitamins. Linus Pauling actually looked into this, and he's, I don't know if you guys remember, but he's kind of one of the big players in chemistry. And he had this theory that you could take as much vitamin C as you wanted, and you could actually improve your immune system. This is why we take vitamin C if you start getting sick. Somebody might say, oh, we'll just take some vitamin C or take some zinc. And that all goes back to whether it's a fat-soluble vitamin or if it is a water-soluble vitamin. So these lipid-soluble vitamins are very important. Then you've got your prostaglandins, leukotrienes, thromboxanes. And then we'll touch on those a little bit near the end because these are going to be more in your hormone categories. And then you've got your cholesterol. So here's our fatty acid structure right here. Here's just an example of our hormone. And then this one is a prostaglandin. Now, prostaglandins are interesting because they actually form a lot of what causes inflammation in your body. So you have got prostaglandins that are protective, and you've got prostaglandins that can be very bad in terms of their inflammation. And prostaglandin 2, or PG2, is usually the one that's associated with a lot of inflammation. Now, prostaglandin 2 can actually be related to progesterone. Now, progesterone in humans helps a woman maintain a pregnancy. And what we find is that when labor is initiated, prostaglandin 2 spikes. And so you see this really interesting relationship between steroid hormones and between prostaglandin, which triggers inflammation and can help trigger the onset of labor. So it's kind of an interesting story. We'll see if we have time to delve into that a little bit more. So let's start with a case study. So here we have a 15-year-old boy. He's a soccer player. And he's complaining of bilateral leg pain aggravated by motion. Now, I don't know if any of you have siblings or children, but they complain a lot. I'm just telling you right now. When my kids played soccer, they were always getting hurt. I mean, they both played goalie. They would come home, bumps and bruises and aches and pains, and I would just be, okay, well, you just went and played soccer really hard. You know, of course, you're going to be a little bit sore. But so this boy is complaining of bilateral pain that's aggravated by motion. He was in good health for approximately 4 weeks before he was seen, and now he's got this tender and painful swelling over the right proximal tibia. Now, again, my kids were goalies. I'd be like, well, you just got kicked. Shake it off kind of thing. So that's what a bad mom I am. Anyway, so during the next few weeks, he develops an 8-pound weight loss, general malaise, meaning he just doesn't feel well. He develops a sore throat. He was diagnosed with strep throat and given an intramuscular injection of penicillin. He's trying to get really healthy, and so he's been supplementing his diet with 6 capsules of cod liver oil and 2 multivitamins per day. And then he's been maintaining this strict diet of liver, milk, and yellow vegetables. Now, he's been doing that for 2 months. That takes a lot of, yeah, that's what I say too. Liver, really? Yeah. Anyway, liver, milk, yellow vegetables, past 2 months. His lab values looked at hemoglobin, 11.7 grams per 100 mils, white blood cell count, 6,300, per millimeter cubed, sedimentation rate, which tells you about how much plasma volume you have, 44 millimeters, alkaline phosphatate, your analysis was normal. So all of lab values look normal. So what's your diagnosis? Other than the fact that he's playing a ton of soccer, he may have gotten kicked, he's eating a weird diet. You'll see. Because green vegetables what? Okay. Okay, so green vitamins have more nutritional value, perhaps, and more nutrients. It's lacking something. Anemic, that's a good guess, but his hemoglobin was normal. So not anemic. That was a very good guess. Yep. Any other guesses? I see a lot of you just being hung up on that. Liver, really? We just can't even think about the liver. I was just talking about this. Well, not about you making them eat liver and onions. Anyway. What about moose liver? You know why? Moose liver can be toxic. What? Yeah. Yep. I'm going to take up moose hunting. Did you see that big freezer in the basement? What about polar bear liver? Polar bear liver is also incredibly toxic. Why? Okay, mercury, that's a good guess. It has a lot of fat in it. And so the fat retains vitamin A. So you have so much vitamin A from polar bear liver, it's toxic. So it turns out that it's called hypervitaminosis. And so the U.S. Reported 62,562 individuals in 2004 overdosed on vitamins. 80% of those were in children under the age of 6, and 53 led to major life-threatening outcomes with 3 deaths. 19,250 people died of unintentional poisoning of all kinds in that same year. So vitamin overdose is actually kind of a big thing. Again, in 2010, 71,000 exposures to various vitamins and multivitamins were reported to poison control centers, which resulted in 15 major reactions. So here's our recommended daily values, and we actually have an upper limit on a lot of these, particularly ones that are fat soluble. So these are your fat soluble vitamins. Vitamin A, D, E, and K are going to be fat soluble, which means your body doesn't get rid of them, right? It retains them in your fat. And so if you're retaining vitamins, you can actually overdose on those particular vitamins. So it was a combination of the fact that fish oil is retained, and then the boy was eating liver, and he was showing symptoms of classic vitamin A overdose. So again, you've got water-soluble vitamins. These are ones that are expelled from the body quicker and in smaller amounts. So you're really not going to store them very much. That's why we can take a lot of vitamin C. So you can take pretty much as much vitamin C as you need to take. This is why. I already told them this story, yeah. You missed out, buddy. I told him about Linus Pauling, yeah. Yeah. It's the only thing I remember about my biochemistry class as an undergrad is the story of Linus Pauling and vitamin C. Anyway, so another couple really important ones, folate. Folate is a really important one because of folic acid, which we know is important for birth defects. We know that niacin, which we'll talk about later, can become very important. And then your B vitamins are also incredibly important for making sure that we maintain good health. But those are water soluble. So you have to take higher doses of them to get benefits from them because, again, they're going to be excreted a lot faster.
B vitamins are associated with metabolism.
Mm-hmm.
That's why Propel has all those vitamin B vitamins. So we'll be talking next week.
I don't know.
Yes, next week we'll talk about metabolism. All those come up.
So, and then you have, again, the fat-soluble one. So they just stick around the body a little longer. It's not like you have them and store them indefinitely, but they'll stick around for a lot longer. So you can overdose on these particular vitamins. Vitamin K is going to become important, and we'll see that one again later. So keep in mind, vitamin K is fat-soluble. So again, if we look at the structure of these different vitamins, you can see some commonalities. Vitamin K is a blood clotting factor here. Vitamin E is an antioxidant, but you can see we've got some of similar ring structures here. Vitamin A is part of the visual pigment system, and vitamin D is in calcium metabolism and bone growth. And vitamin A and vitamin D are linked together. One will help with the metabolism of the other. So we've got biological functions of lipid. They can store energy. And keep in mind that we often think about glucose as being the major energy storage compound, and it's actually lipids. Lipids can provide 2 times the energy as glucose because they are 2 times energy rich in their CH bonds. And they have this hydrophobic nature, so it gets really good packing. So it actually provides more energy than glucose. They can provide insulation from the environment because they have low thermal conductivity. So again, you get those fat layers, and you survive very well in North Dakota. So again, insulation from the environment. We have a high heat capacity and mechanical protection in that it can absorb shocks. We also see lipids present in water repellents. Because they're so hydrophobic, they can keep the surface really dry. So you see a lot of lipids present in like the coating on ducks and bird feathers and things like that, and it helps that water kind of bead up and prevents excess wetting. And then you see them in pigments, the colors of tomatoes, carrots, pumpkins, and some birds, in fact. What kind of lipid do you think is part of pigments? Vitamin A a lot, yeah. Yep. We also see them as antioxidants. This is going to be your vitamin B. We see them help with buoyancy control and acoustics. We see them help with membrane structure. This is the main structure of cell membranes, and this is really a lot of what we care about to maintain our cell membrane structure. Because if we don't have the right lipids and the right balance of lipids, we see all sorts of weird cell things happening. We see cofactors for enzymes, again, vitamin K, coenzyme Q, which we talked about the other day. And then we see them in signaling molecules. So these are going to be your hormones, mostly. So again, paracrine, steroid hormones, growth factors, vitamins A and D are hormone precursors. So let's dive a little bit deeper and talk about some of these functions of lipids, and then we'll talk about the simple lipids and the more complex lipids. So again, they're providing a very efficient energy storage. They can carry more energy per carbon because they're more reduced. They carry less water because they're nonpolar. But we're going to still use the glucose and glycogen for very short-term bursts of energy. Lipids, it takes a little bit longer to release that energy, so those are going to be for more long-term energy needs. Again, this is just another way of looking at, before we classified them according to simple and complex, now we're classifying them according to, here's our storage over here, which are our triglycerides. And then here are all of our membrane lipids. So we've got our phospholipids here, our glycolipids, and then this chart is missing one category. Which is it missing? Which one? It was sitting right over here. Hormones. Yep. Yep, it's missing those hormones on this chart. Because here we're only looking at storage and we're looking at structural.
You know, it's also missing I'm also missing the vitamins we talked about.
Yeah, so they actually get classified as part of hormones a lot of times because hormones and neurotransmitters can be grouped together, and we'll talk about that. And so a lot of those vitamins are going to be, we could add those a little bit, yeah. Well, so one of the things that a lot of people forget about the vitamins when they talk about lipids because they think vitamins, not really lipids. And so they often forget about vitamins and they forget about hormones and they think they're two kind of unique classes.
Just as a note, when you're studying this chart, actually is really, really good because it has all the structures. And so you can get a really good glimpse of, what our swim lipids look like.
It shows you the difference, like how many fatty acids are attached. And
yeah, it does. And so this is a really good study slide if you're interested in memorizing stuff fast. Which I assume most of you are.
if you're interested in memorizing stuff, this is the class for you. No, wait, you're already in it. Okay, so there's some nomenclature that we have to be aware of. Again, we have, these are carboxylic acids with hydrocarbon chains that have between 4 and 36 carbons. Almost all natural fatty acids have an even number of carbons, so keep that in mind. That saturated means there are no double bonds between carbons in the chain, and so these would, if we were thinking about these in a chemistry perspective, they would end in ANE. Like a methane, for example, if you have monounsaturated, it means you have one double bond. Remember that indicative of a double bond is this delta symbol, and then the N is where that double bond is located in the chain of carbons. So if the N is 9, then it means that you're going to be a double bond between carbon 9 and carbon 10. So that tells you where the double bond is located in case you had to actually draw it out. Polyunsaturated means that you have more than one double bond in the chain. And so here's monounsaturated. It gives you kind of this kink. Here's our saturated, meaning that there's just no double bonds. And here's our trans fat. And these are the ones that we particularly want to stay away from. These are straight or mostly straight with some double bonds. Again, polyunsaturated means there's more than one double bond. So you might see something like a 25. 20 indicates how many carbons there are in the chain. 5 indicates how many different double bonds there are. So you would see 25, and then you would see a delta, and then you would see 5 numbers, and that tells you the position of where those double bonds are. So we'll see that in a little bit.
I think so one of the things that's really, really confusing recently is the science of fat, particularly between saturated. Because back, 10, 15 years ago, everyone was talking about how bad saturated fats were and how they go up your cholesterol. But I think over the past 5 to 10 years, we figured out that it was really trans fats that were the problem, and no one really clearly understood the difference between all three as far as impact on diet. I think, in fact, the fats get a really bad rap, and the science still needs a lot of work before I can trust it. I think we raised a generation of people who do. If you watch my kids, they cut all the fat off their steaks, which is the best part, by the way. And see, and actually, there's really good evidence that that's not a bad thing.
Now, it's interesting when you talk about it depends on how that animal is fed. Because what happens if that animal is fed a diet that's really rich in a lot of vitamins? It's what? It could be stored in the fat depending on what vitamins. What happens if it's fed a diet that's supplemented with antibiotics? Some of them could be stored in the fat. And so that's one of the reasons why there's this huge push to antibiotic-free
Well, I'm sure
animals.
antibiotics fall in the same category with
Yep.
fat soluble. Also, things like pesticides. The reason DDT, in fact, the case study that I do with this lecture all the time is DDT, because DDT is fat soluble. So that's the reason it was so bad. It's pulled in.
And it sticks in the pesticides.
Eat something,
Yeah.
if it sits all the way through, you get viral accumulation. And we talk, all of you probably have heard horror stories about how it kills in small children.
Do you guys know what DDT is?
You have no idea what DDT is?
It's a pesticide, yeah.
It was one of the first pesticides ever invented, and a guy actually won the Nobel Prize for it. And that was really bad, a Nobel Prize, but the guy won the Nobel Prize for it. And then it was actually the first, well, some people credit with that being the birth of the environmental movement, because after they started really pressuring people to really investigate the effects that DDT was killing eagles and all kinds of other things. They used it to kill off mosquitoes, which obviously are bad, right? And other things. So
But then the fish were eating it, and then the eagles were eating the fish. And one of the things they saw was that the shells of the eggs weren't firm, and so the chicks wouldn't hatch. And so you saw this decline in bald eagle populations.
and a whole bunch of other
Mhm.
side effects, all because they were fat soluble. Well, so some people really vilify DDT. The trade-off is you get malaria. I don't know. I mean, nothing's ever perfect, right? So you have to basically use it under it. It's very effective.
It is very effective. And we understand things a little bit better now, and so perhaps now we know how to deal with fat-soluble pesticides a little bit better and how to clear them from the environment. There's been a lot of work that's gone into clearing the pesticides from the environment so they don't persist in the food chain.
Sorry, I got
No problem. Okay, so here's our confirmation of fatty acids. This is what you're really looking at here. So you have a hydrophilic head, and then you've got this polar ester group. So in general, these are nonpolar compounds, right? But you have a polar ester group, but it's buried so far in a hydrophobic environment that you really don't see it. And so then you've got this hydrophilic head, hydrophobic tails, and this is what those in general are looking like here. So these are your hydrophobic tail. These are also your fatty acids. Then you've got, here's your glycerol component, here's your phosphate component, and in this case, you have choline right up here. So this is one of the main membrane components.
That's phosphatidylcholine.
Yep.
But there's other, and one of the things that is important is phosphatidylcholine has that head group that's the same. But the hydrophobic tails and the fatty acids, those can be anything.
They can change.
Those can change. There's no sense. That's will depend on what you eat. So if you're out eating it at McDonald's or Burger King and all those places, you're going to end up with those kind of fats in your membrane. That's why you end up with coronary heart disease.
You're giving away all my secrets. You can talk about that later. Okay. So, and then over here, I'm just showing you what kind of elements are in this particular type of fatty acid. So here's our nomenclature again that we're going to revisit. So here's our 25. It indicates that we've got 5 double bonds. Here are the base number, or the carbon numbers. Typically, your carbons are going to be labeled from your C to N. Omega is always the last one. So, and then alpha is the second one, and this is where you can get some chirality. And here's just two different examples of those. So here's a monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. Omega-3 fatty acids, which you see are up here, are essential nutrients. We need them. We can't synthesize them. Most of our diet is omega-6s. Omega-6s actually lead to more inflammation. So they go down a different pathway, and we'll talk a little bit about that pathway later. What?
So you should go back to that. So you'll look, just to confuse you.
He likes to do that.
I don't invent these things. I think there's someone I think there's a biochemistry job who said, hey, let's make these things as confusing as possible for everybody.
Okay.
So just so you know, we number from the head group, from the carboxylic acid head down, the carbons, they go up. But then when we want to go omega-6 to omega-9 to omega-3s, we start at the other end, and we count the other way. So it depends totally on which way, what your reference point is on where you count. You want to make sure you know that. Because if they ask you on a test to identify the omega-6, what is the omega-3, you have to start on the omega end and not on the alpha end.
So you're starting as far away from the head group as possible. Thanks. That was a good addition, not too off topic. So, so here's our omega that you can see right down here. That takes us into storage lipids. So I just wanted to throw this chart up first because these are the things that are delicious to us. And because it's dinner time, I thought, why not look at these? And why not look at how much trans fat is in typical fast foods? So again, we have certain recommended daily allowances of this. And here are our examples. So in a typical serving, it's 28 to 36% of the total fatty acids are if you eat French fries. So that's a lot.
Here's the sad part about French fries.
They're delicious, and you shouldn't eat them.
They used to be way better. And the reason is, and this is where science comes into your diet, right? So Malcolm and I went to a really, really good podcast, which is just the story of the French fry. Tells a story about how we switched from, because of the science back then said saturated fat, they switched the entire formulation away from using beef
Tallow.
tallow. Thank you. So they used fry. McDonald's had that secret recipe where they would use to fry the French fries with beef tallow, which was saturated fat.
It's basically saturated beef fat.
This guy went on a rampage about this. He had someone die in his family with coronary heart disease, right? So they switched everything, and they switched to trans fat, which is actually way worse than saturated fat. It doesn't taste as good. And so you should, the science behind it is actually kind of interesting if you know the backstory behind it. If you know the backstory behind lipid. Even if it's not, it's really a good story. But that's a really intriguing part of how we actually made our diets way worse, trying to make it better. We didn't understand the full picture of understanding what the impact of what we're doing biochemistry on the biochemistry level.
Bet you guys wonder how I found him, huh? and we have these fun conversations over dinner. Tonight we'll have this conversation. Do you know how much fat is in that? All right. So we have remember, triacylglycerols and triglycerides are the same thing. So they can be used interchangeably. They're talking about the same thing. So if you see a question on a test that says triacylglycerol, they're talking about your triglycerides. Again, these are the majority of fatty acids. And the solid ones are fats, the liquid ones are oils. This is the primary storage form of lipids. And they're less soluble in water than fatty acids because they don't have that charged carboxylate group. You can see here's our glycerol atom right here. And then we have our hydrophobic 3 fatty acid chains. So the tri means you've got 3 fatty acids. You don't see the 3 fatty acids if you don't have the triglycerols. So again, they're less dense than water, but they have a lot of energy locked up in them. So here's a couple common ones that you should probably be aware of. Olate is going to be an 18-to-1. What does the 1 indicate? Yep, 1 double bond. So that's an olate, it has 18 carbons. Palmitate is going to be 16 carbons. Is this saturated or unsaturated? Saturated, yep. And then your stearate is going to be an 18-0, meaning you have 18 carbons and it's saturated. And so this is a triglyceride. So keep in mind, as Ben pointed out, that those fatty acids can be anything. Some of them, they don't have to be the same thing. And some of them can have double bonds, and not all of them have to have double bonds.
You should be able to notice the glycerol molecule in there and identify all of the ester bonds that are linked together. You should be able to look at this molecule and note that this is a triglyceride. Do you see it? Look for the esters, and then you should see 3 of them. And you should be able to see the glycerol molecule.
Do you see it now? Does anybody want to point them out? So here's one fatty acid right here. So this carbon must be part of our glycerol, right? Here's a second fatty acid. So this carbon must be part of our glycerol. And this must be part of our ester. And then here's our third fatty acid down here. So this is the third carbon. So your glycerol is sitting right here. You've got your esters are right there. Questions about how to see that? Okay. So remember that the melting point of fatty acids increases as the number of carbons in the hydrocarbon chains increases and the number of double bonds decreases. So saturated long-chain fatty acids are going to have the highest melting point. Triglycerides, rich in unsaturated fatty acids, are generally liquid at room temperature and are called oils. So unsaturated fatty acids, room temperature, oils.
Someone can saturate a fat versus an oil. An example. Fish oil being what? An oil? Okay, that works.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of your fats? Just give me your everyday name. Okay, well, avocado oil, is that a liquid or is that a solid?
If you have the purified oil.
Coconut oil is solid.
Yep.
So is that the fat or oil? Fat.
Mm-hmm.
So is it saturated or unsaturated? Saturated. What kind of bonds exist when you're talking about these molecules? Okay, good. So what other kinds of bonds are there? What can be non-covalent interactions?
Maybe it would be a little easier to see it this way.
What kind of non-covalent interactions can exist between? Yes. Okay, but that assumes what? It's a good answer. But so when you're making macaroni and cheese tonight, because I know about like people are using make macaroni and cheese all over tonight, right? You have to put the tablespoon of vegetable oil in.
Who's putting vegetable oil in their macaroni and cheese?
No, in the water.
Oh, in the water.
So, yes, you'll have hydrochloric effect generally because why? Because it'll mix, right? And generally oil doesn't have any water in it, right? So it can't have a hydrochloric effect because
It's excluding water.
there's no water in it, right? So it's a good answer, right? But in general, there's another kind of bond that exists between non-polar molecules. Electrostatic?
Could it be electrostatic? No, why not? Yeah, electrostatic needs charges.
Right. So we talked about
Somebody said it back there.
Van der Waal. Van der Waal
Yeah.
forces are what you're gonna see between, that's, the other one's hydrogen, right? Can we have hydrogen bonds here? No, so you're gonna have Van der Waal forces, and that's what actually keeps the fatty acids together, and that's what actually, as it cools, because saturated fats can more closely packed, because the double bond introduces this kink. That's why you have solid versus liquid.
See
That
that
would be on
kink
your
there?
exam, like, I'll just tell you that. It's happy you can see that. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And it's staying together because of Van der Waal force.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so it's kind of like if you can imagine like links in a chain. So
Like
if
this.
and they're very dynamic and fluid because they're very small, right? So as they're flowing around, they're breaking and forming all the time.
Because they're non-covalent. Okay, so it's those non-covalent van der Waals forces that are driving this kind of kink formation. Now, this kink formation is because of double bonds.
Right, and that's what makes it an oil versus a fat.
Well, just the way that it's folded up here.
Instead of kink in the
And then
fatty
you've
acid
got
chain.
this kink right here is a double bond.
So it can't pack tightly together. So that's why you get that oil.
So that's this unsaturated at room temperature gives you oil. Mhm.
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah. Yep, it does. So again, here's your melting point. So we're talking about physical.
Like coconut oil solid, but this is when you put it in there and it melts.
Yep.
But so, okay, so just to your point right there, fat is different than oil. So you see on the exam, a fat, if they're not talking about fats in general, they're talking about things that are room temperature, they're solid.
Now, if they're talking about an oil, just know that they're talking about an unsaturated fatty acid that's liquid. There's another question up front here.
On the Van der Waals or in the oil?
They're on both.
They're in both. Yep, they're in both. Okay, so remember that triglyceride-rich and saturated fatty acids are semi-solids or solids at room temperature, and those are those fats. Okay, so that's like your coconut oil. It's called coconut oil, but it should be like a coconut fat, really. So, only that doesn't market well. So, okay. So remember that practically all triglycerides are unbranched carboxylic acids. They range in size 10 to 20 carbons. They're going to be even numbers of carbon atoms. Apart from this COOR ester group, they have no functional groups really. Because they have no functional groups, we don't see a lot of bonding outside of van der Waals forces. Some of them may have a carbon-carbon double bond, but that's really pretty much it. If they have carbon-carbon double bond, the cis isomers predominate. So that means that you're going to be on the same side of that double bond. Chair conformation. So now let's talk about the interesting part for you guys. So there are ways that there are drugs that we can use to treat triglycerides. So high triglycerides are hypolipidemic agents. So these are going to be your statins, bile acid sequestrants, niacin, and fibrates. Fibrates are probably going to be one of the more common ones that you guys see, fibrates and statins. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of those do. So fibrates are going to lower triglycerides because they make it so that the liver can't produce very low density lipoparticles. And we'll talk a little bit about what those are here in a few minutes. And so because they can't produce them, they can also increase the removal of them from the blood. And so they increase the HDL because HDL is removing from the blood, VLDL and LDL are depositing in the blood. So that's why VLDL and LDL are bad and HDL is good. So again, fenofibrate, gemfibrozil, and bezalib. These are fibrates, and you will see those at some point. Then this is niacin. So niacin will decrease the free fatty acids that are released and go into the liver. Without free fatty acids in the liver, that decreases the triglyceride synthesis from the liver, which decreases VLDL, and it just kind of goes back around. But keep in mind that niacin has been linked to liver damage and stroke in some cases, and so typically doctors will only recommend it for people who can't take statins. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that this is water soluble, so you're not necessarily going to overdose on niacin. But niacin has some weird kind of side effects too, so keep that in mind. Then,
Sorry, I can't stand qualifications. Everyone always has a question with myself.
I know I almost dropped this slide out because I'm like, this is pointless. Just know that saponification produces soaps. I'm not even going to really address it, but I wanted you to have the information. It's not. It is not a great story.
Someone thinks it is because they keep telling you over and over and over. In biochemistry classes anyway. So saponification is how we make soap. So if you want to make soap and you're on the prairie, because of the nuclear apocalypse, you take fat from animals and you apply, you put together, and that's what you get soap.
You get soap, sodium soaps.
That's what you make soap. Or if you decide
And
wanna
here you
go
get
outside,
glycerol.
boutique soap manufacturing, there's your formula. And you more on to it.
So that's saponification. We also see saponification as the body decomposes after death. That's what gives dead people kind of a waxy appearance in some cases, is the saponification reaction. That's actually far more interesting than making soap. But still, I don't think it's very relevant for you guys. Just realize what saponification is in case they use the term on your exam, okay? All right. Cholesterol is kind of the big one that we're going to focus a good chunk of our time on. Here is your cholesterol molecule. Remember, your bad cholesterol is LDL, and that's what's going to deposit cholesterol in the arteries. And your good cholesterol is your HDL, and so that picks it up. And here, I kind of like this description, even though you can't read the words, because it shows your HDL as being kind of this concave element, or this concave molecule that can pick up cholesterol and take it with it.
So one thing that's confusing for a lot of students that I think is really important to note is cholesterol is actually that molecule right there.
This guy.
That is not actually what we're talking about when you go to the doctor and they say, hey, you got high cholesterol. That's not what you're talking about. They're not talking about that molecule.
They're actually talking about these molecules.
Yes, we're talking about, and I think the next slide has, yes, this. So don't confuse when you go to the doctor or you're talking to, like, so one of our students just came back from his rotation, and I was talking to them, and they, some of your hospital rotations, you're going to end up interacting with doctors, and they discuss dosing and, medication and stuff. It's really important that you know the difference between the cholesterol molecule and what doctors are going to refer to as your cholesterol levels. Not the same thing. So most, for biochemists, that's cholesterol.
Right here.
The general public,
This is.
for the next slide, they're talking about this as your cholesterol. And cholesterol is an important component in all of these molecules, in all of these entities, but it's only one element.
Yep. So, and remember that HDL is the high-density lipoprotein, and cholesterol is an element of a lipoprotein, and so that's what we're actually detecting. And we use that to detect as an indication of how much cholesterol is there. But you're not, again, directly detecting that cholesterol. And remember that your high-density lipoprotein is the smallest, and your low-density is the largest.
You can even have these monstrosities,
Usually these get filtered out, and so they don't even get tested, but these three get grouped together in your bad cholesterol because they're very difficult to separate out. Okay, so when we talk about the life cycle of cholesterol, again, remember we're talking about the lipoprotein itself, which looks like this. So you have cholesterol ester that's in the center of it, and then you have phospholipid on the outside, and you can tell it's phospholipid. You've got your fatty acid chains here, and then you've got unesterified cholesterol that's sitting in here, and then you have a protein component that surrounds the whole thing called ApoB100. So what you're actually detecting with the cholesterol test is this entire molecule. And this is how that molecule gets processed. It processes through the liver. And so your serum cholesterol level controls the cholesterol synthesis in the liver. And this shows you a much more simple way of looking at it. Your lipoprotein has a protein shell, you've got your cholesterol, and then you have your triglycerides. So you have all three of those elements. Now your triglycerides you can kind of separate out, and we'll talk, not in this class, but in biotech, I'll show you how to calculate your triglyceride levels based on your low density or your LDL. It's a factor of 0.2, just for those who are curious, who just can't wait. I know, yeah, just don't even worry about the class, just forget about it. Anyway, so here you have your VLDL molecule that's produced by the liver. You've got fat cells that are storing triglyceride, and then that converts to your IDL molecule, or your intermediate density lipoprotein molecule, which gets deposited in some cases in your muscles because your muscles are going to burn your triglycerides, and then that converts to your LDL and it goes back into your liver. So again, remember that commonly used statin drugs inhibit this HMG-CoA reductase, which helps inhibit this part right here. Okay, so again, when we're looking at here, keep in mind that if there are a lot of LDL receptors on the surface of the cells, then LDL gets pulled out of circulation and stays on the surface of those cells. So keep that in mind. When it stays on the surface of cells, that's when you end up getting a bad, having bad cholesterol, and you end up seeing atherosclerotic plaques because of that. So, and then the number of LDL receptors is controlled by a feedback mechanism, which we talked about before. So when you have too much and your body is working properly, you can actually control the number of receptors. And then when the concentration of cholesterol inside the cells is high, then the synthesis of LDL receptors is suppressed. So when you have a lot of cholesterol in your cells, you suppress the receptors, then your LDL has nothing to bind to, it gets shuttled through your system, HDL comes and helps bind the cholesterol molecules.
On the previous slide, you showed us what part does it block?
So it essentially comes, and it's in the liver, so it's going to block this kind of production where it goes out. Okay?
I'll talk about it.
So keep in mind these are should be your normal cholesterol levels. That people with diabetes should have a lower cholesterol level than general population. So diabetics' cholesterol levels should only be down around 180, no more than 180. And their LDL should be no more than 100. Our normal total cholesterol should be about 200. It should be, males and females are slightly different, but you have your HDL over 60 is desirable, LDL 100. Now remember, we think of LDL as being bad. You need a certain amount of LDL though. You don't want to have not enough. Then there's this disease called familial hypercholesteremia, where there aren't enough LDL receptors, so your LDL can't bind. And because your LDL can't bind, it just stays and circulates. And so their levels can raise up to 680 milligrams per 100 milliliters. So you can see that that's drastically higher than what we want. 680. That's huge. Death. No, I don't know. I don't know what the symptoms are. But it's interesting because in families where you do see high cholesterol, these people can actually be very fit in some cases. So when my brother was swimming, he swam all the time. He was a competitive swimmer in high school. But my family has a history of high cholesterol, and they tested his cholesterol when he was 17, and it was 240. And the kid, I mean, he was swimming all the time. He was really active. And so there are certain times that it's really hard to control cholesterol with just diet. Although we think about controlling cholesterol with just diet, sometimes it just doesn't work. I don't know what the signs are, though. So keep... Not the arrogant kind. Okay, so keep in mind that high cholesterol leads to heart disease and stroke. 1 out of every 3 deaths is caused by heart disease or stroke. It is a tremendous burden on the healthcare, and it's leading cause of preventable death. There are 2 million plus heart attacks and strokes per year. So it's important that we can help control these high levels of cholesterol because they lead to premature atherosclerosis and heart attacks. So again, if we could reduce sodium consumption by 20%, reduce trans fat consumption by 50%, this is the newest recommendation. And then if we could increase our cholesterol management up to 70%, they could cut this down a lot.
So I'm surprised you guys had that in
It's
this slide is actually the 2015 diet slide. I think the goal is there. Heart Disease Foundation or whatever it is.
That's from CDC.
The slide.
The data is.
The data is. But not any goals. But anyway, I'd be really surprised if you guys had any amount. Probably know that.
So this is, again, what can happen if we see these atherosclerotic plaques. You start out by just seeing this damage, and then as the disease develops, you start seeing plaques in here, and then the plaques can rupture and actually go to the heart. And troponin T is our marker that's commonly used for heart disease or for a stroke. So they can test your blood, they look at it, and they can see at certain levels of troponin T, they say, well, this person had a heart attack or this person had a stroke. Troponin T stays around for a little while, so that's why people can go to the hospital and they say, well, you had a heart attack. They can see some heart damage in some cases, but they can also look for troponin T. So what treatments exist to treat cholesterol? We've already talked about some of them. We talked about ones to treat triglycerides. Remember, statins are probably our number one. In 2013, doctors wrote 263 million prescriptions for cholesterol-lowering medications. 28% of Americans 40 and older, as of 2012, have taken some kind of cholesterol medication, including statins, in the past 30 days, which amounts to $5.6 billion as the total sales for the top-selling statin, which is Crestor, in essentially 1 year. $5.6 billion. That's a huge amount of money. That's a huge financial burden. And this actually tells you how those statins work again if you need that reminder.
Well, there's some really interesting evidence that there's not an association by decreasing cholesterol and actually decreasing disease outcomes. So I think that's something to keep an eye on as you guys start doing your start getting into their field. Because we're putting a huge number of stats into the general population, and there's some people who feel like it does 0%. It generates 0%. It decreases the cholesterol, but doesn't really cost the same when you look for heart disease.
Which is an interesting thing in all of itself. So We also have these bile acid binding resins. So here's our liver right here. We have our LDL receptors here. When we have LDL uptake increased, you can see that going on here. We've got our bile acid excretion that's coming through here. So if we take a bile acid binding resin, because the bile acids can be reabsorbed and go back and produce cholesterol, if you bind them, they can't be reabsorbed. And so then you get fecal excretion here. Again, it uses cholesterol to make these bile acids. And so there are a couple different medications that are listed here. And it prompts your liver to actually use excess cholesterol to make more bile acids because you get rid of your bile acids. So it says, oh, we need more bile acids, so it starts using cholesterol to make more bile acids. So you end up having a lot of bile acids in your feces. Then we have cholesterol absorption inhibitors. So now we're going to inhibit the absorption of cholesterol. And again, this is blocking small intestine from absorbing cholesterol. So it lowers LDL cholesterol and reduces triglycerides. And typically these are going to be used in combinations with a statin because it kind of requires both. And then we have these kind of interesting injectable medications. And Ben's going to talk a little bit about some of these. And here's a couple examples. Here's our Praluent pen. That's an injectable. And you can see this is a PCSK9 inhibitor. And I'm going to leave that to Ben to talk about that story. So we'll take a quick break while he gets set up for Pimal and come back and you'll hear the story of PCSK9.
So it's still going? Great. Super excited about talking. Is there something more effectively? No. Yeah. we learned earlier. So some of them we intentionally show you, and sometimes we intentionally don't show you stuff, just so you can kind of think about it.
Very first question on the aspirin, that was a competitive. Yeah, so remember it had aspirin and ibuprofen, they are competitive. I was thinking of, no, no. If only your facial expression. Yeah, we did though. Okay, you guys ready to hear about PCSK9?
So PCSK9 has affected my life in a lot of different ways. So it's one of the targets that I study. So PCSK9 will clip. It's a serine protease. What are the serine proteases that we talked about? Oh, interesting guess, but no. No, chymotrypsin. I think when we talked about last week, chymotrypsin is a serine protease, right? So what is it? What does serine protease mean?
What's protease?
Yeah, what's a protease?
It's an enzyme, yep.
Good.
And what is it, what's the enzyme doing?
How did you know it was an enzyme? ACE, right? Protease. Go ahead.
So the part, what does that indicate? Protein, yep. So it's an enzyme that's gonna have an action on protein. And what's it gonna do to that protein?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yep.
Serine protease is a Pac-Man. It's going to chomp stuff up. So PCSK9 is a serine protease that's going to come up and it's going to clip off LDL receptors. Okay? That's its function. Right? And so we actually want to develop a drug that could block that. So there was an arms race between Pfizer, Amgen, and Regeneron to see who could develop the fastest PCSK9 drug and get it to market. Okay, and so Amgen and Regeneron got to market first, and then there was this huge lawsuit between the two of them, right? And I was writing a publication with one of the guys at Regeneron at the time, and they, because of the lawsuit, they wouldn't let me publish the paper, so I had to sit on a paper for a year before we could get it. And eventually, he had to take his name off the paper because he didn't want to be associated with that lawsuit. So this has actually affected my life in significant ways, not to mention that my boss worked for Pfizer when they were developing the PCSK9 inhibitor at Pfizer. Pfizer went to phase 3 clinical trials. When they go to phase 3, you're talking hundreds of millions, if not billions, that they've invested in that drug. And they shut down the program in phase 3. Because phase 1, safety, phase 2, efficacy, phase 3, they ramp it up and make sure that everything's okay. Because phase 2 is probably like a couple hundred. In phase 3, they're talking thousands, if not tens of thousands of people to get their numbers right. And so Pfizer shut down. This is what we're going to talk about today. J16, which is actually referred to as BOCO. It's bococixlimab or something like that. I don't remember what the full name is. We just refer to it as BOCO. And so J16, that's what this is the crystal structure, because these days you're finding all the drug companies are putting crystal structures of their drugs in with their targets as part of their patent process. So they'll actually patent this so that when they go to trial, Amgen and Regeneron, for example, so when you saw Praluent in there on the slide, and what was the other one? I forget the other one. Remicade. Repatha, thank you. Repatha. So Repatha and Praluent, those are two, you'll see those when you practice. And those are both for the same thing, but they target different spots on PCSK9. And this one, J16 did. The reason they pulled J16 out is because of what was called anti-drug antibodies, which are non-specific antibodies in your immune system will attack the drug. and that can have all kinds of different consequences. So that's the story behind PCSK9.
So this is a hydrolase. So that should tell you something about what kind of enzymatic action it has, based on the classifications that we talked about, those 6 classifications. And then keep in mind that this is a Fab.
Oh, yes.
You guys know what a Fab is? Other than fabulous? No. Okay, so
Let me just show, that way they can see it.
it has to do with an antibody. Remember how we talked about a lot of the new drugs coming out? And a lot of the most popular drugs are antibody-based, like Humira. Well, this is the structure of an antibody. And the Fab, well, I'll let Ben tell you more about it because this is actually his expertise.
So a full-length antibody in your body is generally, so most drugs are IgGs. That's what that would be the structure of this general one. So a Fab would just be this part of it. There's a heavy chain and a light chain, right? A big chain and so it's actually 2 heavy chains and 2 light chains. This one actually happens to be just this part here. It does not have the FC region, and it only has 1 of them, not 2 of them. Does that make sense? You will see this over and over and over and over and over. And they have all different kinds of mechanisms for integrating. Some people they have SCFVs, which are just the variable region. So the red part's the variable region that actually binds to the target. So they actually have constructs that are just that. They have different kinds of constructs for everything. So that's what new drugs are based on, this premise. So if you go to the PDB, you will see that here's the PCSK9, proprotein convertase subticillin kexin type 9, PCSK9. I don't have this memorized, just so you know. That's what chain A is. Chain H is the heavy chain of J16. L is the light chain. Okay? There's also a prodomain. I'll get rid of that because it just complicates things, and I don't want to tell you that story. It's quite a long story in itself. So I already fetched it. It looks like I'm going to start over because I do not want to deal with that right now because I don't have a mouse. I forgot it. Actually, I didn't forget it. I forgot well, I guess I could go get it. So we'll start over. Fetch 3SQO. Here it is. Now, so I'm going to do select AB for antibody, chain H plus chain L. So you can see that's the antibody right there. So if I show this as a surface and I color it as gray 90, that's what it looks like. This is the Fab part, and Fabs have a characteristic look like a donut, right? And you can see that this is binding. So let me just select PCSK9, comma as chain A, and so you can see there's a prodomain on there, right? We're not gonna include that, so I'm gonna hide everything. Show surface. Dang it. Show surface. Okay, so the green is PCSK9, and the gray is the drug. So we've been showing you a lot of statins, a lot of NSAIDs, a lot of other small molecule drugs. What size is this molecule in comparison to this molecule? Huh? It's pretty equal. What is this made? What is that? It's an antibody, but what is it made of? Or what would you classify it as far as a biomolecule goes?
Be a protein, a carbohydrate, a DNA molecule, nucleic acid,
Lipid.
lipid.
It is not.
Good
But
guess.
it's okay guessing. I appreciate the guess. It's a protein.
Antibodies are proteins.
This is a protein. This is a protein. Both are proteins. Okay? We've shown you small molecule drugs. I think it's really important that you know this point. Okay? We've shown you statins. They're about, what, 100th the size of this, generally, and they fit into what? binding pockets really nicely and they inhibit. Antibody-based drugs are enormous and they block an entire binding region. So this molecule right here, PCSK9, well, we can measure it, but you can just look at this and see, right? Do you not get that sense how big it is?
Oh, okay, I see. So the gray part is your drug, and you're comparing the gray versus the colored. And so the gray versus the colored are approximately the same size. But when we saw our statin and we looked at the enzyme that it was inhibiting, the HMG enzyme that it was inhibiting, we could see that there was a statin that would fit right inside the binding pocket, which means that it was a lot smaller because it fit in the binding pocket. Whereas you can see that there's like a surface.
So what ends up happening with PCSK9, PCSK9 comes in and binds to the LDL receptor right where this antibody binds, right where J16 comes in and binds. So then there's a serine protease. What does this pocket, this hole look like right there? Does that look like a protease site where it can go in and? I wish I could. So you can see so that site right there is a serine protease site. I could color it if I had 20 minutes, but I don't have 20 minutes to go look up all the residues that are the site of the. So it's a serine protease. So what kind of catalytic mechanism exists for a serine protease? Acid-base nucleophile. Catalytic triad. Excellent. So PCSK9 has a catalytic triad. So what happens? Okay, PCSK9 comes in, or PCSK9 binds the LDL receptor, clips it off with that serine protease. Does that make sense? So if we regulate this as a drug, we prevent it from binding, right?
So is it a competitive inhibition or non-competitive? Is it blocking the binding site? No.
It's not blocking. No, it's blocking the binding site. It's not blocking the active site of the enzyme.
So it's blocking the binding.
So it's a non-competitive inhibitor, right? But could you design a drug to block the enzymatic mechanism? It's a serine protease. That's an interesting question because the answer is actually yes, and they have developed a drug. Pfizer's actual other drug that's associated with PCSK9 is a small molecule inhibitor of the enzymatic function of the catalytic triad.
So it goes and sits in there? Is that right?
Yeah. I don't remember because I'm not a pharmacist, so I don't really care about drug names. I like the biochemistry. I don't really care about the drug names. You guys have to memorize the drug names, sorry, and the dosing. I don't care about either of those things. Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah. Because if it's bound, then your LDL can't bind.
No.
Did I say it wrong?
You said it wrong, yes.
Okay.
This is a non-competitive, right? So
No, the other drug you were talking about, if it blocks the.
if it blocks, it'd be a competitive inhibitor
Yep.
because it blocks the function of the enzyme, not the binding. Right. Any questions? All right, there you go. Now you guys get to talk about structural lipids. what's the yellow thing in the tennis, what's binding in that LDL receptor, first off? What's binding in this LDL receptor? What's this tennis ball looking thing? Yep. What's the yellow?
What's the yellow part of the LDL? Do you remember? Go back a couple slides.
It is a protein?
Yeah. Do you remember the name of the protein? That ApoB 100. It's the protein that kind of wraps around, and it helps with that recognition of the LDL receptor.
All right. You want LDL to, yes. No, the other way around. You don't.
Yeah, so LDL is going to deposit its cholesterol. So it starts a signaling cascade. LDL comes along, it binds the receptor, the cholesterol gets deposited in the cell. Your cells need a certain amount of cholesterol because, as we'll see later, our steroid hormones, all of that is going to be derived from cholesterol. So we need a certain amount of cholesterol. So when we are talking about cholesterol tests, and this is where it gets kind of confusing, you're actually testing how much LDL is in your blood. So if you have too much LDL in your blood, then that means that you have a lot of cholesterol either in your cells because your receptors have been downregulated, which means that there's no place for LDL to bind, or we've given you a drug so it can't bind. So it stays in the blood. If it stays in the blood, then you start getting the formation of plaques because it starts binding your platelets and you get all sorts of different things going on. So that's when you start getting binding of plaques. And then we haven't really talked too much about the HDL, but HDL picks up cholesterol and removes it from your bloodstream. So that's why you can have a relatively high LDL, but as long as your HDL is also high, then it kind of counteracts that because it can take that out of your bloodstream. Does that make a little more sense now? Okay, good questions. Cholesterol is really, really important for you to understand. Yeah? Sure.
Cholesterol in here, is that like a measurement of like LDL and HDL? Like, what do they measure in food?
Oh, good question. So in food, I have no idea what they're actually measuring. I'm guessing that they're measuring the actual cholesterol molecule because remember the LDL and HDL are actually compounded with protein components and with your phospholipids, and they're not going to complex it, I don't think. So I'm guessing they're measuring the actual molecule itself.
It's mainly triglycerides.
Mhm.
It's a good question. Actually, you should look that up.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll give it some extra credit.
Sure.
I'm curious now.
Sounds good.
Let's do it. Just shoot me off in class.
Okay.
After we compare dogs. That's our thing.
Sort of thing. Okay, so we talked about our storage lipids, and cholesterol is a big part of that, right? Now we're going to talk about our structural lipids. And this, again, you have these polar head groups attached to nonpolar tails, and usually there's going to be some form of fatty acid that's there. So we can modify and have a different backbone. We can change the fatty acid, or we can modify the head group. So there are 3 different ways that we can get diversity in our structural lipids. Again, the properties of the head group actually determines the surface properties of the membrane. So if your head group is an alcohol, you're going to have different properties than vice versa. And different organisms have different head groups. And different tissues have different membrane lipid head group compositions. And so here's one example. Again, here's our cholesterol molecule here. Here's a sphingolipid, which we'll talk a little bit about. It's attached, here's our head group right here, and then it's attached to sphingosine. And then here's our glycerolphospholipid, and our head group here is ethylamine. Here's how it all fits together in your membranes. You have a bunch of different types of components, and then you have free cholesterol that's kind of of fitting in here as well. So cholesterol is really important for us. We sometimes think of it as just being a bad molecule, something we want to get rid of, but we have to have a certain amount. So I put this in here, again, as kind of a cheat sheet of the different structural lipids that we're looking at. Here's our phosphoglyceride or a phospholipid. We have an alcohol as our head group. We've got a phosphate bond. We've got our glycerol. And then we have 2 fatty acids coming off of carbon 1 and 2. And so that's our phosphoglyceride or our phospholipid. We've got our sphingomyelin. This, again, has an amino alcohol group, but it has the same phosphate linkage, and then it has a sphingosine instead of a glycerol. So that's different. And then you have only 1 fatty acid here. This one is really important when we talk about myelin sheath. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then here we have a glycolipid, and this is a specific one called sabronoside. And this one is really important. You have the sugar residue, and it's got a very different kind of linkage here. It doesn't have your phosphate linkage. It's very different. And then you have the sphingosine again instead of glycerol, and now you only have 1 fatty acid. So these are similar from the tail region, but the head region is very different. So when we look at our classification, just to remind you, we've already marked off our storage lipids, and so now we've got our membrane lipids here. So we've got our phospholipids, our glycolipids, and then our hormones are going to be kind of over here, so we're not really looking at this part of the chart right now. And this shows you very similar to what this just shows you, only it's a little bit more simple here. At least I thought it was. So we have our complex lipids, which is what we're heading into now. And it should just point out here that you've got your alcohol down here. Choline is going to be part of your head here for sphingolipids. And then your glucose or galactose is going to be for your glycolipids. So our phospholipids are going to be our primary membrane component. These are going to contain an alcohol, 2 fatty acids, and a phosphate ester. Remember that you're using a phosphate ester here. And that you have this alcohol and then the 2 fatty acids. So in glycerol phospholipids, the alcohol is glycerol. So that's just one type. And here's our different types of phospholipids up here. You have your phosphoglycerides showing over here. And we'll look at a couple of these different ones. And then sphingomyelin fits underneath the phospholipids because you're using an alcohol group. And then you have your glycolipids over here. So again, in sphingolipids, the alcohol is sphingosine, which is right up here, and that's what the R group is indicating here. And then you have your glycolipids, which are also considered complex. And they just have your carbohydrate head group. So that's how all these complex ones are kind of fitting together. So when we look at our phospholipids, again, these are going to be the main component of our membranes. And so we have this typical fatty acid side chain, our glycerol backbone, and our polar head group that contains choline. And then we have this phosphate ester linkage. Again, don't forget this phosphate ester linkage, and don't forget about choline here. So the glycerol phospholipids, here's L-glycerol 3-phospholipid. This one's incredibly important for when we talk about energy utilization. And we can get both a D and L depending on which side that's on. Just know that you can have chirality here around the glycerol. Here's our glycerol phospholipid. We've got our glycerol, 2 fatty acids. Here's our amino alcohol. So that's our glycerol right up here. And then we have our phosphate linkage. And then here is our palmitic acid and oleolic acid. Do you remember how many carbons we should have? So palmitic should be 16, and oleanic should be 18, I believe. So when we look at our general structure, Here we've got a saturated fatty acid of palmitic acid, and then we've got our unsaturated, and this is a polyunsaturated, and this is linolenic acid. Now, linolenic acid is pretty interesting because linoleic acid can also be used as an antibiotic by itself. So that's kind of a weird, interesting antibiotic that actually looks like an oil. And then we have our glycerol up here and our head group substituent. So again, each derivative is named for the head group alcohol, and then you put phosphatidyl in front of it. And that's how you name these things. And this is kind of the simplified way to draw them. So if you see something like this, just know that you're dealing with a glycerol phospholipid. So if we have serine, it's phosphatidylserine. If you have ethylamine, you have phosphatidylethylamine, which is also known as cephalin. If you have choline, then you have alectin. These ones are really, really important. We'll talk a little bit more about these. If you have inosol, then you have phosphatidylinosol. Again, another incredibly important one for energy storage, and we'll see a lot of these two later. So lectins and cephalins, you can see them shown over here. They're found a lot in your brain and nerve tissue. And you can also find them in egg yolk, wheat germ, and yeast. So these ones are going to be really important for nerve and brain tissue function. Your phosphatidylserine, this has key roles in cell cycle signaling, specifically for apoptosis and coagulation. So again, it hits that coagulation cascade and can actually promote blood clotting. And apoptosis is programmed cell death. So that's why this one's really important when we talk about how cells die. You've got phosphatidylcholine. Again, this is going to be a major component of biological membranes and of pulmonary surfactant. So remember, we've got surfactant in our lungs, and this is what they're measuring when they are looking at whether babies' lungs are developed or not yet, is they're actually looking for phosphatidylcholine. So remember that lung surfactant is about 90% lipids, and a lot of these, it's only about 10% protein. And so again, you have this terminal sac that's inflated. Without the lung surfactant, you don't have the surface tension to maintain that. And so again, that lung surfactant is what they're measuring with babies to see whether or not their lungs are mature enough to be delivered. You have phosphatidylethylamine. Again, this is nervous tissue, particularly the white matter of your brain. And in that particular type of tissue, in your spinal cord and your neural tissue, it's 45% of your phospholipid makeup. So this is a major component in brain, spinal cord, is this phosphatidylethanolamine. Your sphingolipids kind of fall under here. The sphingolipid myelin is found in the coatings of your nerve axons. So when we talk about demyelination diseases, such as multiple sclerosis and muscular dystrophy in some cases, you're getting a degradation of your sphingolipid, or else you're not able to produce it and replenish it. So here we can see that the backbone is, again, sphingosine and not glycerol. You have an amide linkage, not an ester linkage. So we're seeing a different type of linkage here. And your polar head group is connected by a glycosidic or phosphodiester linkage. Where have we seen phosphodiester bonds before? DNA, yeah. And where have we seen glycosidic? We're going to see it in carbohydrates, but remember we did see it with the connection of the base to the nucleotide. Thank you. Drawing a blank on the name. So, yeah, so you see it there. Remember we had that beta-glycosidic linkage there? So here we're seeing that polar head group connected to the connected through this glycosidic or phosphodiester linkage. And then we've got sugar-containing glycophospholipids on the outer surface of plasma membranes. And so here are a couple of different ones. This ganglioside GM2 is going to become incredibly important for a certain disease condition called Tay-Sachs, which hopefully we have time to look at. So here are a couple important ones that you can see over here. Again, this ganglioside GM2 and sphingomyelin are going to be, and ceramide, which we already talked about. And here's how the X group is changing. These different molecules down here are indicative of different types of sugars. So your sphingomyelin, here's your ceramide right here. Again, this is the myelin sheath. It has the building block of that, and it's the primary source of ceramide, which is necessary for signal transduction. So without this molecule, you can't transduce that signal. You can't actually get that signal going through. You also have sabrinosides, which again have more monosaccharides linked by a glycosidic bond. So here's our sphingosine right here. You've got a glycosidic bond here because you've got a sugar. And then you have a fatty acid. So again, these are present on the cell surface, and they're really important for cell recognition and immunity. So if we want to be able to determine what's self and what's non-self, you want this on your surface. Your gangliosides, again, accumulation of GM2 is what's causing Tay-Sachs disease. And these are abundant in the cell membrane, and they act at the surface as receptors for hormones. So if you have too much of it, you start getting kind of these diseases of accumulation, which we've talked a lot about. And Tay-Sachs is an important one. So here's kind of the deal with Tay-Sachs here. So you have GM2. So this is a lipid or fat, again, that enters the nerve cells. And then among those healthy components, you've got the lysozymes. Now the GM2 goes in lysozymes. You can think of a lysozyme as kind of the stomach of the cell. That's where it's going to go and be metabolized. And so you end up seeing this enzyme called hexaminidase A, or HEX-A, that digests GM2. So in Tay-Sachs, they don't have HEX-A. So they can't digest GM2, so you get too much GM2 that accumulates in the cells and blocks nerve impulses. And so it's, again, a neurodegenerative disease. You have ganglioside here. We see this is really important in HIV because of this immune type recognition component. You've got these sugar residues here that you can see shown right here. So you've got sugar residues linked through the sphingosine with your fatty acids, and this together is giving you this ceramide. So this is the ceramide. Now, this becomes really important when we talk about blood groups. So this is the basis for why we have O, B, and A blood groups, are these sugar residues that identify self and non-self. So we can see that the blood groups are determined. Here's your ceramide right here, and then you've got your sugars right here, and whatever this antigen is, so you can see the difference here, gives you O, B, or A. So in individuals with no glycosyltransferase, you get the O antigen. If you have a glycotransferase that transfers in acetylglycosamine or galactosamine, you have A. So that's A. And if you transfer galactose, you have B. So that's what gives you that recognition. That's why you can't give somebody who has A blood type B, because this part is different. It's one sugar residue different. But that means that we immediately recognize that B as being non-self and will respond to that. But you can see why O is the universal donor, right? Because they don't have anything here. So we will accept O. This is how blood groups work. You have your glycolipids that are shown over here. Here's your beta-glycosidic bond, just like we saw with our nucleotides. Cardiolipin is, again, a very important one of these. It is on the inner mitochondrial membrane, and it maintains the respiratory complexes, and so you can see that here. Here's your polar head group in cardiolipin. And then here's plasmalogen. This is common invertebrate heart tissue. And its function isn't very well understood, but we know that it's resistant to lipases. Remember, lipases are going to cleave lipids and break them down. And this molecule is pretty resistant to those lipases. And so we're not quite sure why it's resistant. We're not sure. There's some theories that suggest that it's going to increase membrane rigidity. So it's going to increase the rigidity of your cell membranes. That could be a good thing, but it may not necessarily be a good thing. We also think it could be a source of signaling in lipids, and it may be antioxidant. So we really don't have a good feel for why we have this, but we know where it's found. And we know that it's found in the heart tissue. And so here's your ethylamine head group here. And remember, you've got this ether-linked alkene. And then that leads to, again, this platelet activating factor, which we can see is very similar here. We have the ether-linked alkane instead of the ether-linked alkene here. But then we also have this acetyl ester over here and a choline over here. And so this is what's going to activate platelets and initiate a coagulation cascade. So this is what's going to initiate a lot of your blood clotting. We're going to save turnover of membrane lipids and talk a little bit about it when we talk about how we recycle different things. But the interesting part about here is you can see different diseases that if we have a block in the lipid metabolism, you can see that we get different diseases here. And we talked about Tay-Sachs already. So again, our phosphodidylinositol, or PI, it's present in all tissues, but it's really abundant in the brain tissue. Here's what it looks like. We think that it has functions in cell signaling and as a reservoir for arachidonic acid. Now, arachidonic acid leads to prostaglandin. So if we process, remember our omega-6s are going to lead to arachidonic acid, and arachidonic acid can lead to prostaglandins, which increase inflammation. So arachidonic acid is also very, very important when we talk about inflammatory pathways and what's good and what's not good for that. And this is important in protein anchoring because we see how it can anchor in there. And here's our cleavage site for our phospholipase C right here. So this is how they anchor. Here's a GPI, or a G-coupled protein. And this is the core modification, so it kind of sits in this membrane. Here's our extracellular space that can come along and interact with this, this glycoprotein. And you can see these are the sugar residues sitting out here that indicate, is this self, is it non-self, is this something I should be interacting with or not? We'll go a lot into this on Thursday when we talk about membranes. So that takes us through to hormones. Now, hormones and neurotransmitters